This is the first video of Chapter 5, which is entitled India's Foreign Trade. Now, this chapter is only going to be broken into 2 videos, and each of the videos is rather lengthy, so I recommend you have a piece of paper and a pen somewhere around you. Okay, so let's get into it right away. The first thing is, we're talking about foreign trade, so there are a couple of concepts you have to have a firm understanding of. Firstly, exports refers to the goods that are produced domestically but sold internationally. Imports are those goods which are produced internationally but sold domestically. It's a very simple way to keep them separate. And usually we talk about the difference between exports and imports as net trade. And if you have more exports than imports, you're running what we call a trade surplus. And if you have more imports than exports, we have what you call a trade deficit. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the 2 key periods of time: before independence and after independence. Well, as you know from earlier chapters, before independence, India was completely controlled by Britain. And after independence, they basically have the right to do whatever it is they want. So let's move into a closer examination of what was going on before independence. As you can imagine, before independence, India was selling its raw materials to Britain. Britain was taking those raw materials, converting them into final products, and then selling them not only back to India, but around the rest of the world. As a result, Britain was able to increase the value that they were getting on their investment. For example, let's say you buy wheat in India. You take the wheat, which was purchased at a very cheap price of, let's say, 50 rupees. Then you take that wheat, you convert it into bread and sell it at 200 or maybe 250, 300 rupees. That buffer of profit that you're collecting is the value added here. So Britain was able to do that by selling their goods around the world, not only in India, but everywhere else. This graph here represents India's GDP prior to independence. So as you can see, the amount of growth in GDP was very, very minimal. However, at the same time, Britain was exploiting India and using it to create tremendous GDP growth. That's why we often say Britain was taking advantage of India. So let's look at some more details. What we have here is a trade surplus for India. And as you remember from earlier, a trade surplus simply means that the amount of exports are greater than imports. But India was producing goods that Britain wanted and needed, not goods that they wanted and needed. And that's a critical point to understand here. People were starving, but instead of producing food, India was producing indigo so they could sell it to Britain for its production purposes. Now, if we just look at the volume of trade here, so the trade surplus is actually quite meaningless. In nominal terms, the trade surplus in 1946 and 47 was 31 crore rupees, and by 1947-48 it had fallen to 14 crore rupees. But the key point to remember here is not the numbers, but rather the circumstance. It was not beneficial to India in any which way or manner. Now let's jump ahead and take a look at after independence. Well, what happened to trade after independence? This graph here on this page indicates the value of exports and imports. And as you can see, exports have always lagged behind imports. But in the first plan, the second plan, third plan, fourth plan, fifth and sixth plan, even in the seventh plan, the results of trade were so marginal. They don't even show up on this graph. So from the beginning of the 8th plan, that's when the government took real initiative to expand growth. And since then, exports have been less than imports, which is completely different to what was going on prior to independence. But this is not a disadvantage. The blue lines here represent imports, the green lines represent exports, and the gap here represents the trade deficits. So if we look at this in a different light, so just to be clear about the gap here, I created another graph for you so you could understand what's going on. Beginning in Plan 9, we can see that beginning with Plan 9 until Plan 11, and probably continuing till today, the trade deficit has continually increased. So I want you to think about what that might mean, right? We know that the trade surplus prior to independence meant that India was being exploited for its resources. But now you should carefully consider what the meaning of this trade deficit might be. So what's amazing is the textbook doesn't really talk about this trade deficit in any great detail. Rather, it likes to talk about the volume of total trade. But that is a very rare measure to consider. We should be considering the gap between imports and exports, whether it's a trade surplus or a trade deficit, but the book is only concerned about total trade. And I have a feeling they do this because they want to show Indian statistics in a rather positive light. But the reality is we should only be concerned about the deficit. But the book here talks about this total increase of trade volume, and it comes to three rather peculiar conclusions. Firstly, that the rise in trade was a result of the base effect. And what that means is that in the beginning, the level of trade was so low, so insignificant, that the increases over time seem significantly large because we started from such a meaningless value of trade, overall trade. In the first plan, the total value of trade was only 6,760 crore rupees. But by the end of the 11th plan, it is exponentially larger than it was in the beginning. Secondly, India's share of global trade since 1991 has improved directly as a result of the plans. I think this is also a little ambitious. There are a number of things that happened in 1991. World trade agreements started to take place, and this is not simply a result of this trade plan, but rather around this time was the beginning of the internet age. So to say that this is entirely a result of the plans, it is overestimating the ability of the Indian government to bring about change directly as a result of policy. And finally, the third point it reached was, prior to the 7th plan, trade volume was insignificant. Okay, those may be true, but they're not what's important. What's really important is that India was, at one point, a net exporter, and they ran a trade surplus when trading with the British. But today, they're a net importer and run a trade deficit with the rest of the world. Now, let's take a look at the composition of foreign trade. What makes up foreign trade? Well, we have agricultural exports, conventional items, and manufactured goods. Beginning with the decline in the percentage of agricultural exports, we notice that there has been a significant decline in the percentage of agricultural items being exported. Well, one of the reasons is they're no longer being exploited. Secondly, production shifted away from goods that were required for the British government and moved to domestic production to satisfy local needs and wants. Next, there's also a decline in the percentage share of conventional items. So although these conventional items include jute, tea, food grains, and minerals, the amount of production being done in other areas was basically non-existent. As a result of government planning and increased domestic demand, the types of goods being available in the market have increased. And as a result of that, the percentage of share to conventional items, jute, tea, food grains, and minerals, has fallen. Another way of saying this, in a way that you might be able to understand easily, when Nike started their company, they sold one pair of sneakers. And those sneakers were popular and accounted for 100% of their sales. But over time, Nike produced different brands, Air Jordans and a whole bunch of different lineup of shoes. And as those shoes' sales increased, the original brand sneaker was no longer 100% of their sales, but rather 10 or 12 or maybe even 5% of their overall sales. And that's exactly what was going on in India. They produced only jute, tea, food grains, and minerals, but over time they started to produce other goods, and these goods became less important. Finally, let's talk about the percentage of manufactured goods. Well, these obviously increased, and this increase has led to increased exports of final products. So at one time, India was a source of raw materials for the global market, especially for Britain. However, today, it is a source for final production because of its cheap labor. So what does that lead us to? Well, the important conclusion here, the most important conclusion here, is that India is no longer a backwards economy. And we can prove that by demonstrating that the percentage share of agricultural exports has declined, the percentage share of conventional items has declined, and the percentage share of manufactured goods has increased significantly. So let's take a look at why that's happened. Well, one of the reasons is India has far more trading partners than ever before. As you all know, it was only Britain before independence, but today we can list all of these countries as our trading partners. UAE, China, USA, Switzerland, Singapore, Australia, Iran, Hong Kong, Korea, Indonesia, UK, Japan, and Belgium. If you look closely here, there are only 13 countries mentioned, but the world is a big place. There are more than 170 countries globally, so there is potential for India to increase its global trade with other countries, which could further mean rapid expansion in foreign trade, both in terms of imports and exports. Now, one of the points that was mentioned in this textbook that's very important for you to have a clear understanding of is a year of divide. A year of divide, as mentioned in this book, was only after 1990, so basically starting with 1991. And that means from 1991 onward, if we take a look at the total trade of India, we can see that is the inflection point, or the point at which trade took a turn for the better and increased rapidly. Now, this graph here demonstrates trade in terms of total trade, not exports minus imports or imports minus exports, but rather the total volume of trade, exports plus imports. And from that point of view, this is clearly true, and it looks very, very exponential. However, even in terms of exports alone, or imports, or even the trade deficit, which we would draw in an inverse shape, we'd notice that all of the trade after 1991 has increased rapidly. And that's why this is known as the year of divide. So what have we come to in these two sections of Chapter 5? Well, we've come to realize that India is no longer dependent on Britain. India is no longer exclusively involved in raw material production. India has moved to production of final goods or manufactured products, and trade has rapidly increased since 1991. Those are the key takeaways, but of course, you should remember the details as to why those things happened.